Those of you who are familiar with the movie The Grinch Who Stole Christmas, there's an underlying, principle or lesson that is behind that story. As silly as it might be and everything like that, if you're not familiar with the story, it's basically about this town called Whoville that is approaching Christmas. And they have really gotten it wrong what Christmas was all about. They were really just delved into the whole idea that Christmas was just about buying a bunch of stuff, exchanging a bunch of gifts, that Christmas was really about just gaining a whole bunch of stuff. And it had basically become just a materialistic type of approach to Christmas. And the Grinch, not purposely, but maliciously, goes on Christmas Eve, and he goes and steals all the Christmas presents from Whoville. And he takes them back to his lair, for lack of a better word, his cave. Or he's beginning to take it back, and then the people at Whoville wake up and all their Christmas presents are gone. And even the tree is gone. And through this process of having their Christmas presents taken away, they began to realize the true meaning of Christmas. That Christmas isn't about presents, it's not about gifts, but it's about relationships. Long story short, spoiler alert, but the Grinch has a change of heart also, and he ends up bringing the gifts back to the people. But now they've learned the lesson that Christmas isn't about gifts, it's about people. It's about the loved ones that you share it with. And so we see from that movie or that book, Dr. Seuss book, or however it is that you engage with that particular story, that sometimes we need things taken away from us, stripped from us, before we can really find the true purpose and meaning of life, or in our relationships, or ultimately in our relationship with God. And so today we're going to explore that a little bit. Because if you think about it, probably one of the hardest things, if not the hardest thing that we face as human beings is the loss of things. Loss is one of the most difficult things to deal with emotionally, physically, even spiritually in some cases. Whenever you lose something, it could be the loss of a job, it could be the loss of money, it could be the loss of certain possessions, or in the extreme case, it could be the loss of a loved one. And whenever we feel lost, whenever we feel like something has been stripped from us, something has been taken away from us, it's a very difficult thing to process. It's a very difficult thing to wrap our minds around. And so I think it'd be helpful for us today to kind of just think about that, sit on that a little bit, camp out there, and reflect on, how is it that we can properly respond to loss in our lives, respond to the stripping process that we go through, and how is it that we can get through that process and be better off in the end? And we'll be using Joel as our text, the book of Joel, particularly in Joel chapter 1. If you're using a Pew Bible, it's on page 909. If you're not using a Pew Bible, it's going to be kind of towards the end of your Old Testament. But the book of Joel is considered among one of the minor prophets, and it's a difficult book to date. Perhaps the best guess is around 800 BC, but around the time of the reign of Joash. But nonetheless, we really don't know exactly when it was written, but we do know at least the context of what's going on in Joel. If you remember, God had called Abraham way back, thousands of years, or centuries before even Joel was written. God had called Abraham to receive his blessings, his promises. He calls him out of Ur of the Chaldees, and he goes into the land of promise. God says, I'm going to give you a lot of abundant seed, a lot of descendants. They're going to have this land, and they're going to possess this land. And God takes them through centuries of being in Egyptian bondage, but long story short, they end up back in the land of promise, and they become God's established nation on the earth. They are God's covenantal people. And in connection to that, God had given them a law. He had given them the law of Moses. And in that law, they were taught morals, how to treat one another. They were also taught how to approach God through the sacrificial system. And then they were also taught civil laws, like how to enact justice and things like that. Them being a theocracy, an actual nation, they needed to know these things. And so God had given them a law. Well, as time had progressed and as time went on, They ended up replacing God with a king, saying, you know, we want a king like the rest of the nations around us. They rejected God as their king. And then they go through this long line of different kings. And sometimes they had a good king, but most of the time they had a bad king. And over time, they just got more and more, they drifted more and more away from God. God had blessed them. They were in a good land, a land flowing with milk and honey. They were blessed abundantly. They were right in a hot spot, right in a wonderful spot for trading with other nations. They're right on the main highway that goes from the northern nations to the southern nations. They were in the best spot. God gave them the perfect location to flourish and to really prosper. Unfortunately, though, because they were so blessed, because they had so much material possessions, they began to drift away from God. They began to become prideful. They began to enact injustice and be just evil, acting in an evil way, falling off after idols, going after the nations around them. They really drifted away from God, and it really traced back to this idea of this material wealth that they had. Well, the book of Joel is, a lot of it's messianic, and it's mostly known for chapter 2, where it really gets into the pouring out of the Holy Spirit. It's quoted in Acts chapter 2. But when you look at the beginning of the book, a big section of it has to do with the judgment that God is going to bring against his people. Basically, what he's going to do is he's going to send locusts. He's going to send locusts to basically strip the land bare. Some see this as a metaphor for a nation or an army that was coming in, but I think the best reading is to say that, no, this was actually literally locusts that God was going to send into the land. And this is what it says in chapter 1 and verse 4. It says, what the gnawing locust has left, the swarming locust has consumed. And what the swarming locust has left, the creeping locust has consumed. And what the creeping locust has left, the stripping locust has consumed. So, I mean, you have these different waves of different locusts, and these different locusts mentioned are probably different types of locusts that would come in and eat different types of vegetation and things, and they were just coming in waves. It's like they get hit with one type of locust, and it would strip things pretty well, and then another swarm of locusts would come in, and they would strip even more, all the way down to where there's basically nothing left. And so this nation had definitely experienced the stripping away of everything, at least as far as vegetation goes. And of course, that doesn't just affect the farmer out in the field somewhere, some guy out there in the field. It affected everybody. It affected the drunkards. In verse 5, it says, awake, drunkards, and weep, and wail, all you wine drinkers, on account of the sweet wine that is cut off from your mouth. And of course, this would affect the drunkards, those who were addicted to wine, who were basically making their whole life about drinking wine and things like that. They would be affected because, of course, if the locusts come and strip everything, they're stripping the vine, they're stripping, the grapevine, and wine cannot be made without those sorts of things. And he'll talk about that here in a moment. And so the drunkards lose that life of pleasure, of luxury, of gluttony with wine, and it's completely stripped away. And he goes on to say in verse 6, for a nation has come up against my land, mighty and without number. Its teeth are the teeth of a lion, and it has fangs of a lioness. Using a metaphor to describe these locusts. In verse 7, it has made my vine a desolation, and my fig tree splinters. It has stripped them bare and cast them away. Their branches have become white. So Israel was considered God's vine. Isaiah talks about that. I believe it's in chapter 5. He talks about Israel as the vine. Well, Israel as the vine has been stripped bare because of the locusts coming in and taking over. But then he talks about not only the drunkards, but the people in the city would be affected, not just the farmers. In verse 8, it says, wail like a virgin girded with sackcloth for the bridegroom of her youth. And it's believed that what's being spoken about here is Jerusalem. Given the feminine language, typically Jerusalem was spoken of as a female, as her, that sort of thing. It's believed that this is probably speaking about Jerusalem. So the people in Jerusalem were going to be affected as well. And of course that makes sense, right? Where does the people in the city get their food? Well, it's got to come from the agriculture that's going on outside the city. So they're affected. But not only them, the priests are affected. In verse 9, it says, the grain offering and the drink offering are cut off from the house of Yahweh. The priests mourn the ministers of Yahweh. And so even the priests in the holy place in Jerusalem don't have the offerings to offer to God. And this is more than just, well, we want to offer God a sacrifice and there's no grain around. This affected them in their belly too, because where did they get their food from? They got it from the offerings that the people would bring. So they would get a tenth of the grain offerings, a tenth of the sacrifices they would receive as their own food. And so if there's no grain offerings being offered up, that affects the priests in a very real way. And of course it affects the farmers, the ones that we would typically think of. In verse 11, it says, "Be ashamed, O farmers, wail, O vine dressers, for the wheat and the barley, because of the harvest of the field, perishes. The vine dries up and the fig tree fells, the pomegranate, the palm also, and the apple tree. All the trees of the field dry up." All right, so here he's mentioning, of course, these are representative plants. These are the main plants that you would want. You'd want the vine tree, the fig tree, the pomegranate, the palm tree, the apple tree. These were trees that if you had in your nation, you were seen as a very prosperous nation, a well-supplied nation. And it's representative of all the plants. But the idea here is that the farmer is ashamed. It's like, well, the harvest is here, but I don't have anything to harvest. I don't have anything to take to market. I don't have anything to trade. I don't have anything to sacrifice or to give as an offering at the temple. They're ashamed because everything has been stripped. And if that wasn't bad enough, it just mentions everybody. Continuing in verse 12, it says, "Indeed, rejoicing has dried up from the sons of men." Sons of men here, of course, representing everyone. Everyone who was human. Within the nation, their rejoicing had dried up. So everything's stripped. Externally, all the plants are stripped. Vegetation is stripped. Internally, all the rejoicing is stripped. Everything that they took pride in, everything that they rejoiced in, everything that they were seeking pleasure and comfort in, everything that they were using to build themselves up and to tear other people down, all that now has been stripped away. All that has been taken from them and has left them really just back to the bare roots of life. Now, God's not doing this just to be mean. We got to remember that. Why is God stripping them bare? Well, in chapter 2 and verse 12, we see why God is prophesying that this is going to take place. And the point of it is for them to repent. He says, "Yet even now, declares Yahweh, return to me with all your heart, and with fasting, weeping, and wailing, and tear your heart and not your garments. Now return to Yahweh your God, for he is gracious and compassionate, slow to anger, abounding in loving kindness, and relenting concerning evil." So he's wanting them to come back in a relationship with him. This is not a vengeful God who's just looking for them, looking to drop the hammer on them and enjoying stripping all these things away from them. This is God pleading with them, saying, look, all this has got you distracted. All this has got you going in the wrong direction. These blessings were supposed to draw you closer to me in gratitude and thanksgiving, but instead it's translated into rebellion. And therefore, in order for me to establish a relationship which is not just pleasant to me, but beneficial for you, I've got to strip all these things out so that I can then draw you close to me and all these distractions will be taken away. And he's asking them, hey, even now, return to me. And I'm gracious and compassionate, slow to anger, abounding in loving kindness. And he says, relenting of evil. In other words, I'll relent, I'll turn back from, I'll change my mind about sending that evil experience your way with the locusts and all those things. And so here we see, certainly, that God had a purpose in stripping these things away, with the purpose of and the intention of them returning to God in repentance. So we might say, well, as New Testament believers, how does this affect us? What is the purpose of this happening in our lives? Well, we're told in scriptures in John chapter 15 that we too as believers will experience a certain stripping. There it's more called a cleaning, or could also be translated a pruning. In John chapter 15, Jesus relates himself to being the true vine. So Israel was the vine that got it all wrong, as we mentioned before. But Jesus is the true vine. He's the one that was truly the one who could impart life. And starting in verse 1, he says, I am the true vine, and my Father is the vine grower. Every branch of me that does not bear fruit, he takes away. And every branch that bears fruit, he cleans it so that it may bear more fruit. So he says here that even for those who are bearing fruit, even those who are in a relationship with God, they're doing well as far as their spiritual life, or at least somewhat well in their spiritual life. Sometimes God's got to prune that individual, that branch. He's got to clean them. He's got to, I'm sure you probably are all familiar with what pruning is. Pruning is where you cut off the excess off of a branch. If you have a branch that's bearing fruit, if you have too many shoots, you got too much going on, too much, the life of the branch is going in too many different directions, and it's just overgrown, the best thing you can do for that branch is to cut it back, trim it back, cut off all that excess, so that all the life that's flowing through the branch can be concentrated and it can be a more abundant fruit. And Jesus is using that metaphor to talk about us. And sometimes the Lord has to prune us. Sometimes we have to go through a pruning process so that we can become more focused, more concentrated, and bear more fruit for Him. And so this is a concept that's not just true in the Old Testament, but it's also true in the New Testament. It's not just true for sinners and rebellious people, it's also true for dedicated Christians. Oftentimes we have to go through a pruning process, a stripping process, if you will. I'll submit to you that there's three different types of stripping we might go through. Three different types of pruning, whatever you want to call it. Three different ways in which we experience loss. Things that are taken from us for a higher purpose, or can be used for a higher purpose. One of them is just natural loss, natural stripping that we go through. You know, just being human. Sometimes we experience loss. Things are stripped away from us. It might be maybe the loss of loved ones. People that we love, just because, you know, eventually we all grow older. Eventually people do die. We do live in a dangerous world. Even young people die and perish and things like that. And oftentimes we lose loved ones, and that's a part of life. That's just a part of the human condition. And sometimes we experience loss in that way. Sometimes we just experience loss because the economy is bad, or powers beyond our control. Things happen in our lives that cause us to experience loss. It might be the loss of relationships, not through any fault of our own, just by the nature of the situation. Sometimes, you know, we have a break in a relationship, or maybe we have to move away because of a job or something like that. There's a lot of different ways in which we experience loss just in a general way and in a very natural way. And of course, in those particular situations, the best thing we can do is say, you know what? This may not be because of any sin in my life. May not be because God is purposely stripping this from my hands or anything like that. It's just a part of life. I can still learn lessons from it. I can still say, you know what can I learn from this? How can I use this to draw closer to the Lord? Sometimes when we experience loss in that way, and something is taken away from us, it catapults us further away from God. And we should never do that. If we're experiencing loss, it should draw us closer to the one who can offer us that consolation, that comfort, that help, that inner strength that we need to get through those difficult days. We should draw all the more closer to God when we experience that loss. And the loss in these very natural ways can be done and can be responded in three different ways, in which we could experience the loss and fall away from God and be propelled away from God. We can use it to draw closer to God, or we can just make it not do anything, and it just doesn't do anything in our lives. It doesn't change us anyway. We don't learn any lessons from it. We don't draw closer to the Lord. We may not be going further away from the Lord, but we just kind of become indifferent to it in regards to our spiritual life. Now, we can use loss to draw closer to God, to realize, you know what? I want to hold to the one who is everlasting. I want to hold to the one who is the one who was, who is, and who is still to come, the everlasting one, the rock, the one that I can hold on to in a relationship with and hold fast to, that will never slip away, that will never be stripped from me. And when we experience loss, it should make us to strive even more for those more substantial things, those eternal things, those things that are everlasting. And loss can help us, wake us up to make us think, okay, yeah, that's right, this world is transient. Yeah, that's right, these relationships that I have are temporary. Now let me gaze up at the eternal. Let me have eyes for heaven. for the eternal promises that God has given me. And we can use those loss, even if it's just a natural loss, to propel us even further, to hold on to the everlasting arms of God. But we could also say sometimes things are stripped from us directly from God, which is what we see in Joel. There's sometimes God has to strip things away from us because they are distracting us. With Israel, we saw that things were being stripped from them because, or the things that were stripped from them because it was the very things that were drawing them away from God. When God allowed the free flow of wine, when he allowed the abundance of the olive trees, when he allowed the grain to flourish, when God allowed their storehouses to be full, they rebelled against God. They used their wealth to go out and play the harlot with other nations and with other gods. And so God had to directly step into the situation, strip them of all those things so that they would return to him. Again, in a heart of restoration, not just vindication. And sometimes that's true with us as well. And we have to recognize that, sometimes God might be stripping something out of our lives for a particular reason. And we just think, well, isn't life rough? Or isn't life tough? Oh, let me pick myself up and keep going. And we miss the lesson that God has given us. And we're missing the reason why that might have been stripped away in the first place. You might say, well, how do we know the difference? How do we know when it's just a natural loss and when it's something God has taken away? Well, the best thing we can do to try to determine, we can't always determine with 100% accuracy, but look at the baggage that's attached to that. When something was taken away from you, or you see something might be possibly stripped away from you, look at everything that's connected to that. If it's a relationship, and that relationship has a lot of baggage, you realize that relationship was something that was really drawing you away from God, maybe because they were tempting you to do things you knew you shouldn't do, and it was getting harder and harder to resist. Maybe that relationship was just constantly agitating you and causing you distress, or whatever the case may be. That relationship was really causing an ink stain in your life. And you see that, and you make that connection and say, oh, okay, there's probably a good chance maybe God has taken that away from me because that was something bad in my life. That was something that needed to be taken away. It might be maybe God causes financial problems with us, and if we really think about it, we might say, you know what? It is true. I was trusting too much in my riches. I was becoming prideful and looking down on others because of my wealth, and maybe God caused this financial issue to happen to humble me and to bring me back. You just got to kind of look at what's in connection to that. Israel and Joel could have looked at all the things that were being stripped away through these locusts and say, oh yeah, you know what? God said that was going to happen way back in Deuteronomy. He said that when we entered into the land and we became prosperous, that we would rebel against him. And they could have made those connections and say, yeah, that looks about right. God is correcting us, and he's stripping away the very thing that's becoming a hindrance to us in having a deep, abiding relationship with him. I'm not so sure that they made that connection, but it would have been possible for them to do so. And so it is with us as well. When we experience loss and things like that, it's important for us to think, okay, is this just a part of life? Or was this something that was hindering me from drawing close to God? One other thing we could consider, is this something that I've been hurting people with? Maybe God's taken away something because you've been using it to injure others and to hurt others and to cause consternation and problems and difficulties in other people's lives. So there's a lot of different things to consider, but consider the package. Consider the whole situation, everything that's connected to that particular thing that you're experiencing loss of, and you can probably pretty tell if God's taken it away because of that. And if that's the case, of course, the lesson to learn is, God, I know that you took this away because either I was abusing this, or I was misusing this, or it was detrimental to my spiritual life, or whatever, and receive that with gratitude. And say, Lord, now I want to draw my attention to you. I'm not going to be angry with you for taking away. I'm not going to be dissatisfied with you. But with gratitude, I accept this loss, and I'm going to use it to draw even closer to you. And that can be helpful in those particular situations. But then there's a third option. So we have just natural loss that happens just because we're human, and we're all a part of the human condition. There's also loss when God directly takes something out of our life because fill in the blank, whatever that reason might be. But then there's a third way we can experience it, and that is where we purposely strip ourselves of things that are getting in our way of our relationship with God. And I would say this is probably the best way of experiencing loss, because this is saying, you know what, I'm not going to wait until God has to grab something out of my hand and strip it out of my hand because it's dangerous to me or dangerous to the people around me. I'm not going to wait for that. I'm going to willingly set it down, realizing that this is a danger. This is something that can hurt me or others, and I'm going to lay it down at God's feet. That's the best option. It's the less painful option on your side, but it also saves a lot of hardships and difficulties for everybody along the process. And so this is something that is very, we should very much consider in our lives. Look around in our lives and say, you know what is the overgrowth in my life? What are the things that are robbing the life of Christ from me, that is causing my spiritual life to really be spread out, thin, and just going in too many places, and my mind's going in too many places, and it's not allowing me to really stay focused and stay fixed on Christ. And there's a lot of different things it could be. You know, one of the main ways that people do this is through fasting. And check with your doctor before you start fasting. I always have to say that. But, you know, fasting is a good way to do this, where you say, you know what, for 24 hours or for a couple of days, I'm just going to refrain from food. And I can't explain to you the neurological processes that go on when you're fasting. Only through experience I can say it very much does help you focus on God. When you say, you know what, even the most basic thing that I need for life, I'm going to put aside for a little bit so I can focus on God. It just sharpens your spiritual sight so well. And I can't even explain why or how that happens, but it does. Jesus did that. Remember when he was baptized, after he was baptized by John the Baptist, he was led by the Spirit into the wilderness. And what did he do there? He fasted for 40 days. So Jesus himself was preparing himself for this rigorous ministry that he was about to engage in, ultimately dying on the cross. He prepared for it by fasting so that he could focus himself on God, so that he could really do serious business with Satan in the wilderness, and that he can hit the ground running after he got through the process. And so if Jesus fasted to help him on his walk before God, it could be helpful for us. So it might be that we just need to strip ourselves of food for a little while and say, I'm just going to focus on God. It might be that maybe giving of our wealth might be a way we do that. Remember the rich young ruler that Jesus encountered? The guy came up to him, you know, he's rich, he's wealthy, he's young. Pretty much everything we want in life. We want to be young, we want to be rich, and we want to have power. That's typically what humans want. And he had it all. And he comes to Jesus and he says, you know, Lord, what do I need to do to receive eternal life? And Jesus says, well, what do the commandments say? And he reads off the second stone of Moses that was more directed towards people. You know, do not steal, do not lie, do not commit adultery, don't murder, you know, all those things. And this rich young ruler says, all those things I've kept from my youth. What do I still lack? Jesus said, well, you've been missing on the first stone of Moses, which is all about being God-centered. He says, go out. He didn't literally say that. I'm paraphrasing. But in essence, that's what he says. And he says, go out and sell all that you have and give to the poor, and then come follow me. Whoa, you want me to give up my wealth in order to follow you? It's not that everybody has to sell all that they have to follow Jesus. It was because that individual needed to do that to strip away that God, the God of Mammon, that had been distracting him from following Jesus and would have distracted him all the while following Jesus. He needed to get rid of that. He needed to strip himself of that so that he could have wholehearted devotion to Christ. And so it might be the case that we might need to do the same as well. Has my wealth really been a means by which now I've just been distracted? I'm living this materialistic lifestyle. My heart's drawn to all these material things, and I'm constantly distracted by the wealth that I have, or it's causing me to look condescendingly on other people and to walk with pride. Is my wealth becoming a stumbling block in my life? Well, that's something that we can willingly give up. Well, probably wouldn't be easy for an individual to do it. The rich young ruler walked away sad because of it, but it might be something necessary for us in order to remain wholly devoted to God. And those are just two examples: fasting, giving of our money, our wealth. But it could be also any stumbling blocks that we have. Are there things in our lives that are just a stumbling block? Our cell phones. Our cell phones can be a great stumbling block. We might have to just do away with our cell phones. Who would be willing to do that? If nothing else, decreasing our screen time on our cell phones. It might be not hanging out with our buddies on the weekends because they always lead us to do things we shouldn't do. It might be movies. It might be TV. It could be a long list of things, but there's a lot of wisdom to being able to see that ahead of time and to say, you know what, I'm going to willingly give this up because this is harmful to me spiritually, and it could also be harmful to other people around me. And so sometimes we experience loss because we willingly give it up. But the good news is, however we experience this loss, whether it's natural, whether it's God taking it from us, or it's us willingly give it up, that we have the promise that we will have things restored to us one day. In Matthew chapter 19, starting in verse 27, and this is actually after Jesus spoke to the rich young ruler. He gives them some comments on the rich and how difficult it is for them to enter into the kingdom. Peter says in verse 27, then Peter answered and said to him, behold, we left everything and followed you. What then will there be for us? So we have stripped ourselves. We left everything. We were fishing and we left our boats. We were mending our nets. James and John could have said, and we left them and came after you. We even left our father in the boat with his servants. We left everything. Even Matthew himself, who's also named Levi, who wrote this gospel, gave up his tax collecting. God came, or Jesus came while he was at the tax booth, and he just left all the money, everything, and followed Jesus. So anyway, Peter's saying, we left everything. Well, what will there be for us? Verse 28, and Jesus said to them, truly I say to you that you who have followed me, in the regeneration, when the Son of Man will sit on his glorious throne, you also shall sit upon 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel. And everyone who has left houses, or brothers, or sisters, or father, or mother, or children, or farms, for my name's sake, will receive 100 times as much, and will inherit eternal life. But many who are first will be last, and the last first. That's an encouragement for us. When we experience loss, when we have things stripped away from us, if we do it remaining faithful to the Lord, if we learn the lessons, if we have a heart attuned to God, and we say, you know what, I'm going to use this situation, whether this thing was taken from me through natural causes because God took it from me, or I'm willingly giving it up, I'm doing it with a heart to be even more dedicated to God, to draw closer to Him, to turn my face to Him, and to seek after eternal things, heavenly things. When we respond in the appropriate way, we have the promise of not only just having things restored, but experience even better things in the regeneration. When it comes to the resurrection, the new heavens and the new earth, when our bodies are regenerated, remade, we're going to have blessings way better than what we have on this earth. Anything that we experience as loss on this earth is going to seem like nothing compared to the glories that we're going to see. We're going to have God Himself. We're not going to have a temple. And God Himself, in all of His glory, is going to overshadow us in His light and in His glory. We'll be with God forever in His direct presence. We'll be worshiping Him, serving Him, loving Him. We're going to be in a place where there's no sickness, no crying, no death, no mourning. We're going to be in a state of eternal bliss for eternity. It's not like something like, well, this is just fun for the weekend, but got to get back to work on Monday. This is something that's going to be with us forever. It's like 1,000,000 years have passed. Hey, I'm going to enjoy 1,000,000 more, and 1,000,000 after that. It's going to be a wonderful and glorious thing. And to keep that in perspective when we experience loss. Yes, loss is hard. I don't want to diminish that. I don't want to make it sound like it's not a big deal or just kind of gloss over it. It is hard. It's very difficult to experience loss. From the smallest things to the largest things. It's one of the most difficult things to experience. But just remember, one day we're going to receive so much more. And God has so much prepared for us, and we need to remember that. So that should all the more cause us to want to be more and more dedicated to Him when we experience the loss of all these things. Now, there are some things to consider here, and we kind of already touched on this. These are more points for clarification. I want to be very clear that just because a person experiences loss doesn't mean that they're being judged by God. I think maybe we made that clear, but I really want to make that clear. let's not be judgmental. Let's not look at someone else who's going through a hardship. Maybe they lose their house to a fire or something, or they lose their possession and say, oh, they must have some sin. Oh, they were too involved in material things. That's why God stripped that away. Let's not ever have that heart. And I don't want anyone walking away from this lesson with that heart. Nor should we be too hard on ourselves, because we do live in a fallen world and things do happen. There are house fires. There are, economy issues with the economy sometimes, if not a lot of times. And we have a lot of problems in this world, and we just got to be very careful that we're not too hard on ourselves or too hard on others in relation to that. I wanted to make sure we made that clear. Just remember Job. Job was the most righteous person that lived at his time. And he had everything stripped from him. His barns were torn down, his animals were taken, his children died, and even his own health was taken away. And Job had done nothing wrong. And that just happens sometimes. Sometimes there's things going on in the other world that we don't know about. We just have to trust in that. So it doesn't necessarily mean that someone's sinning just because they enter hard times. But I will say, every time, no matter the reason for the loss, it should be a time of introspection and increasing our sensitivity to God. Every time. No matter what the cause, no matter what the reason, it should always lead to that. So, when we experience times of stripping, when the locusts are coming into our lives, metaphorically speaking now, when the locusts come in, they just come in waves, one after the other. It seems like we just can't get a break sometimes. We need to recognize God's potential for working in our lives. We need to maintain sensitivity to what he might be teaching us. We need to respond appropriately to his pruning process. And remember that the ultimate goal is spiritual growth and a closer relationship with him. Boy, if we can come out of loss with that, we'll be coming out of loss with a gain. And hopefully that would give at least a little bit of relief to the loss that we've experienced. So if you're here this morning, that's our lesson for this morning. If you're here today and maybe you've been a little bit reluctant to follow Christ because you don't want to give something up. Maybe you don't want to give up your weekends, or you don't want to give up a relationship with your parents, or whatever the case may be. Maybe it's going to immediately cause loss in your life as soon as you enter into the baptismal waters. I'll just re-emphasize again. What you have to gain far exceeds what you have to lose. What can a man give in exchange for his soul? Jesus said. What can you really give up that would even equal or even compare to the glories of eternal life with God forever? Be willing to give it up. Make that first step. God will give you the strength. He'll give you the help to make the journey. You just make that first step. And be willing to forsake all for him, and he will give you more blessings than you can even imagine in the future. So if you'd like to come to Christ this morning, please come forward as we stand and sing the song that JT has prepared.